Madam President, there is extraordinary economic hurt in much of rural America this evening, and that is especially the case in my part of our country and in rural Oregon. We're going to have a chance to do something about that with the tax extenders legislation, and I come to the floor today to urge its passage. A number of colleagues have been wondering about the folks in green shirts who are out and about on Capitol Hill this afternoon. These are some of the country's best people committed to making this country a better place, and they are here because they come from communities where the federal government owns much of the land, and the federal government, regrettably, has been talking about breaking its commitment to these communities. About 100 years ago, the federal government entered into an agreement with these communities. In effect, the federal government said, when the national forest system is created, so it benefits people across the country, in Minnesota and New York and Florida and all across the land, because we're going to have property owned by the federal government, we'll assist those communities with funds for schools and essential services. And that worked for a number of years when the timber cut was fairly high, and we were able to get the funds that those communities needed for essential services. But when the laws began to change in the 1990s and the timber cut went down, all of a sudden, those communities were hard-pressed to keep the schools open. In my part of the country, to make sure that there was law enforcement on the beat, fighting methamphetamines and providing essential law enforcement services. So in 2000, I authored a law with our friend and colleague, Senator Craig. It brought those communities money for schools, money for essential services, but regrettably, that money has run out. And now, because of the good work, particularly of Chairman Baucus and Senator Grassley, there will be an opportunity to renew our commitment to these rural communities, and to do it in a way that is going to allow these communities, after a few additional years, to get into additional opportunities for economic growth and creating good-paying jobs for their citizens. For example, I've said that if we pass this legislation and it authorizes $3.8 billion in desperately needed funds for rural schools and essential services, we're going to use those 4 years so that at the end of that period, our rural communities can be involved in a number of other economic development activities that will allow their communities to prosper. For example, we know in our part of the country, and this has been true in much of the land where there's great risk of fire, there's a need to thin some of these forests. In our part of the country, it's second growth. It may be different in the Midwest, in Minnesota, and other parts of the land. But the point is that working together, people in the forest product sector, environmental leaders, scientists, and others can come together and over the next 4 years act in a fashion that will allow us to say that on our watch, by making sure that we acted today so these communities could survive, we used this period so that they could get into additional opportunities that would allow their communities to prosper, and that there would be good-paying jobs for their people. Right now, Madam President, pink slips have been sent out to county workers, teachers, and others, and without the action that has been achieved in the extenders legislation on a bipartisan basis, led by Chairman Baucus and Senator Grassley, without their work becoming law, it's my view that the very fabric of rural communities in our part of the country and much of the United States will be torn asunder. A number of colleagues have worked hard on this legislation, and that is because this 100-year commitment that we have had with rural America has always been bipartisan. The fact of the matter is, Americans who enjoy the national forest system don't come to the forests and get asked about whether they're Democrats or Republicans. It's been something that's been beneficial to our nation. And in return, we said that our rural communities would be given the funds they needed for essential services. The fact of the matter is, in much of the country where there is not federal land, where there is not land in federal ownership, they sell private property, they generate revenue, they pay for essential services. That's what's different about my home state, where the federal government owns much of the land. We haven't been able to do that. And I see my friend and colleague on the floor, Senator Craig. We worked together to update our commitment to rural America back in 2000. We put in place, for example, resource advisory councils, and Senator Craig remembers this well, that brought together people in the forest product sector, environmental leaders. Several of them said, what you were able to do with Senator Craig has got people working together in the natural resources field who never worked together before. So this has been a program that has worked. We have tried to extend it on a multi-year basis. I offered legislation previously with Senator Craig. We got 74 votes. An overwhelming majority of the United States Senate supported this legislation, but yet we were not able to get it enacted into law. I would be happy to yield.
Madam President.
Senator from Idaho.
Madam President, let me thank the Senator from Oregon, Senator Wyden, for the work that he has just continually done in behalf of timber-dependent school districts and this uniqueness that western states have, that have these large portfolios of public land and have grown increasingly dependent upon the action taken by the federal government and the reaction in the states and the impact of the economy of local communities. When he and I stood together and worked out Craig Wyden, and worked with our timber-dependent school districts and got it funded, we solved a very big problem. And the advisory committees you speak to, Senator, were in themselves a phenomena, in the sense that after 2,300 decisions by those groups to do activities on public lands, and not one of them objected to by an interest group or a suit filed to stop them, I grew and you grew convinced that we can work together to resolve our public land issues when we put determination and resource behind them, and that's what we did. And I thank you very much for staying with it. It's my understanding that in the tax extender package that we will consider this coming week, that we will see a reauthorization of Wyden Craig, that will get this work done, send a message back to our school districts and our counties that we are here to help, to assist, and to stabilize very dire economic conditions that those school districts and counties are experiencing. And I thank you for sticking to it and sticking with it, because it's that kind of resolve that may solve this substantial problem. And I thank the Senator for yielding.
Madam Chair, I don't want to turn this into a bouquet tossing contest, but the fact of the matter is that Senator Craig and I have been partners in this for some time. We felt that we had a good model when we moved to pass it during the Clinton years in 2000. It has exceeded our expectations in terms of bringing people together and helping these rural communities to survive. And I simply say to colleagues that as part of this tax extenders package, by extending the program now through 2011, the legislation would give rural communities the certainty that they need to plan for the future and get them off this roller coaster of disaster one day, hope the next, that has been the pattern of the last few years. There's a lot of exciting things going on in the rural West. My friend from Idaho and I, as we sat in the forestry subcommittee, have heard the exciting developments, for example, in thinning. We've heard about good work that is being done in terms of biomass, taking essentially woody waste and turning it into a source of clean fuel. And we've been working together to make sure the federal government gets the right definition of biomass so that we can allow these programs to go forward. Carbon sequestration would be a third opportunity that we know will be a sensible step because it will help improve the climate and create jobs. So as Senator Craig and I have sat and listened to this testimony, lo these many hours about thinning and biomass and carbon sequestration, it became clear to us that as long as our rural communities weren't denied the funds they needed to keep going, which is what we're talking about today, they could use these next 4 years to get into some very exciting and promising fields in the years ahead.